We just finished a Ministerial Roundtable, but not just ministers, also some key stakeholder groups, including local government and women's community-based organizations, and some of my UN colleague agencies, for example, the Climate Change UNFCCC organization. The objective of the meeting was to work out how we can break down silos. You know, each government has a transportation ministry or an environment ministry or an economic planning ministry, but disaster risk and climate risk cuts across these silos. And so we were seeking the views of the ministers and others about how they and their countries have gone about breaking down the silos. And there were so many ideas, I can't even share them with you in detail, but at the highest level, there was the idea of embedding disaster and climate risk in national development plans. But then, even this applies not just at a national level, but also state or provincial plans and local government, because as our colleague from Auckland in New Zealand highlighted, there's silos even at local levels, and there's some very interesting, innovative techniques that they've developed to break down the silos. And so I think there are very interesting tools, for example, cross-sectoral teams, accountability frameworks, putting in place laws that require sectors to collaborate on this issue. And a really important point, there were two really important points. One was, if you want to bring about a change like this, it's best if it's supported at the very highest level. The President, the Prime Minister, if they're engaged and want to ensure disaster risk and climate risk is addressed, it's much more likely to happen in the sectoral silos in the bureaucracies. And the second was the fundamental urgency of addressing climate risk as part of disaster risk. Mostly because the urgency is because we're running out of time to reduce greenhouse gases enough to avoid huge increases in hazards, in disaster risk. So I think this was another element to try and embed disaster, climate risk within disaster risk at every level of society, from national or actually even regional level, because we had the African Union Commissioner here, and she was highlighting the role regional decisions and agreements can make in helping break down these silos. So it was really a wonderful meeting. I was taking notes and notes, which I'm going to study later, and we'll use in UNISDR to help roll out this work on disaster risk reduction. Well, the financing issue, this was actually one of the issues that was discussed about how do you get sectors to listen to this, different agencies and sectors. The idea was you gather the data on what disasters are costing in sectors, in the agriculture sector, in the transportation sector. When you have to rebuild a bridge because it keeps getting washed away in floods, it's a waste of money. So you should, help them be aware of the costs of disasters was a key way of breaking down the silos. That was a key issue. I've been so busy at some fascinating meetings that I've seen only 5% of the action that's happened at this meeting. But I know from my colleagues there have been partnerships agreed, there's funding from donors for key initiatives, for example, on multi-hazard early warning for small island developing states and less developed countries. There are science and technology partnerships and roadmaps that have been agreed and are now being implemented. And at the global level, we're now refining and getting ready to roll out this system of holding governments accountable for the commitments they themselves have made in the Sendai framework to reduce disaster risk. There's a monitoring system that member states have supported that we're going to roll out, because I'm sure you know, if you don't measure and monitor, if it's not transparent, sometimes things don't happen as fast. So that's a huge outcome. But as I said, I'm really looking forward to meeting with our colleagues from UNISDR at the end of the meeting to hear about all the other elements of the action that has been developed here. Well, India has been absolutely fundamental in regional and global leadership on disaster risk reduction. Prime Minister Modi hosted the Asia Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction last November, which agreed an action plan for all of Asia to implement the Sendai framework. And also he announced some wonderful initiatives to reduce for resilient infrastructure. You know, there's huge investments in infrastructure, and much of that is in Asia. The OECD has said it's something like $50 trillion in new investment in infrastructure. 1 billion new homes need to be built, given the population growth. And so if that infrastructure is not informed by disaster risk, like building a hospital in a flood zone, then we will not achieve the outcomes of the Sendai framework. So India has played a real leadership role, and some of those same themes, including on infrastructure, were raised at the ministerial sessions here at this meeting. It's, of course, the more states that are involved in working out solutions, the better. I think the Sendai framework was signed by the member states of the United Nations. Different countries have different capacities to implement. You know, I know some small island developing states, it's just a few people in the ministry that have the expertise. And so, and I know one of the challenges we heard is if they're spending all their time talking to donors and reporting, they can't do their jobs. But on the other hand, they need the funding. So it's a catch-22, I think, for some countries. So I think, you know, because the risks are going up with climate change, we're seeing more and more of these events, it is becoming impossible for any country to avoid this issue. And in fact, the lion's share, the leaders I speak with and ministers, they are so fully committed to addressing disaster risk. Their challenge is knowing what's the best way to do it, how do I fund it, where do I get my financing to do this, but they really are focused on the impacts, because it isn't just about an immediate disaster. They have knock-on effects to food insecurity and people movements and even conflict, as we've seen in many parts of the world. So over time, those that aren't, I'm sure, will increasingly engage, because it's a matter of survival and economic prosperity, and we can't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without addressing these challenges. Well, my expectations for the next global platform are that when we look back at that next global platform in Geneva and we look back at the action plans that were developed now and are looked at, that we will have crossed off the list all those things we wanted to do. And actually, we should be optimistic, because if you look back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was hardly even an awareness of disaster risk as a concept, and we've actually seen a huge decrease in loss of life from disasters. If you look at a country, and not just rich countries, but less developed countries, Bangladesh has made huge progress in reducing loss of life with early warning, storm shelters, evacuations. Some of this was donors supporting Bangladesh, but Bangladesh deserves by far most of the credit for its leadership and its commitment to do that. Mexico, the Hurricane Patricia that hit Mexico recently, the Mexican government evacuated 1 million people. This is amazing change in preparation and awareness. So that's why I'm very confident that at that next global platform, when we look back, we will have crossed off all these other steps that we're taking up to the ideal goal of achieving these targets in the Sendai framework.